The late afternoon sun hung low over dry mesa, spilling long ribbons of gold across the brittle grasslands. The heat shimmered above the ground, but Grant Hollander barely felt it. He leaned forward in the saddle of his black stallion, pushing the horse harder than he meant to. Something cold, sharp as a winter blade, had been crawling down his spine all day, tightening with every mile he rode. Cowboys in the West lived by instinct. Instinct kept a man alive longer than luck ever did. And today, every instinct Grant possessed screamed the same thing. Get home. Now. The Hollander Ranch finally came into view. Its weathered barn, the pale fence line stretching like a tired spine, and the small, quiet house sitting under a cottonwood tree. Too quiet, no laughter, no shouting, no thudding footsteps of children racing to the porch to greet him. A silence as heavy as dust in August settled around the homestead. Grant slowed his horse, studying the yard with a narrowed gaze. Wind brushed across the porch, nudging the screen door so it creaked. Soft, lonely, offbeat, like something wasn't right. He slid off his saddle, boots touching the earth without a sound. Even the air felt wrong. As he stepped toward the house, a shadow moved near the barn. Before Grant could reach for the revolver at his hip, a hand shot out and grabbed his wrist. He spun, only to face Akioha. The Apache girl stood half hidden in the dim barn doorway, breathing steadily despite the urgency in her eyes. Her skin, sun-browned and wind-shaped, held the hue of canyon earth. Long black hair, braided with feathers and glass beads, brushed her shoulders. Her eyes, dark, alert, fiercely alive, watched him like a mountain cat gauging danger. "Don't make a sound," she whispered, voice low and steady as Riverstone. "There's something happening inside your house, and it's worse than you think." Grant froze. Akioha wasn't the type to exaggerate. She didn't run to white men's houses without cause, and he could feel her hand trembling ever so slightly against his skin. Not from fear for herself, but fear for someone else. "My kids?" he breathed. Akioha nodded once. Without another word, she guided him along the side of the house, her steps light as a deer's. They reached a narrow crack in the shutters, just enough space for Grant to see inside. What he saw made his stomach drop like a stone thrown down a dry well. Emma, Oliver, little Sophie. All three were kneeling on the cold wooden floorboards, backs stiff, heads bowed. Their small shoulders shook from silent sobbing. In front of them stood Patricia, their stepmother, holding a strip of leather in her hand. Not a belt, a whip. Thin, cruel, and meant to bite. And Patricia's voice slithered through the air, sharp, poisonous, dripping with contempt. "You think you can disobey me? You think anyone will believe a word from your little mouths?" Oliver flinched as she raised the whip. Not striking this time, merely waving it, savoring their fear. Grant's blood ignited, his jaw clenched, fingers curling into fists. He lurched forward, but Akioha grabbed his arm with surprising strength for someone so slender. "If you rush in now," she hissed softly, "she'll twist the story. She'll make the town believe you're the danger. She's done it before. Let me help you, please." He could barely breathe. His children, his babies, forced to kneel like criminals in their own home. He felt fire clawing at his chest. Rage, guilt, and something darker he'd kept buried since his wife died. He wasn't sure whether he wanted to shout, cry, or tear the door off its hinges. Instead, he whispered, voice hoarse, How long?" Akioha's eyes glimmered, not with fear, but with the kind of grief carried by someone who had watched too much cruelty in her lifetime. "Almost a year," she answered. The wind howled outside, shoving itself under the porch boards like it was warning the whole valley that something inside the Hollander home had just reached its breaking point. Grant Hollander had once been the kind of man other ranchers pointed to with quiet respect. A steady, broad-shouldered cowboy who lived by the saddle, built by sun, sweat, and stubborn grit. Life on dry mesa had carved him into something tough, almost unbreakable. Dawn to dusk labor never scared him. Roping wild mustangs, wrestling fence posts in blistering heat, surviving dust storms that swallowed the sky, none of it ever rattled Grant. What finally broke him was something no bullet, no outlaw, no drought could ever match. The night his wife died. It happened fast, too fast for any man to make sense of. One moment she was laughing at Sophie's crooked braids. The next, fever stole her breath like a thief in the dark. Grant had held her hand till morning, praying in the quiet, helpless way a cowboy prays when the world he knows begins to crumble. When she slipped away, the house felt colder than a January canyon. Grant fell hard into that emptiness. He didn't cry, not out loud. Men like him rarely did. But something inside him folded and stayed folded. He moved through the days like a ghost in his own home, doing chores, checking cattle, but never truly living. The children grew quieter, meals grew shorter, nights grew longer, and Grant, too weighed down by grief to steady himself, made the worst mistake a grieving man could make. He handed pieces of his family to the wrong person. Patricia Ellis entered his life like a soft breeze drifting through a broken window, gentle, polished, seemingly harmless. She had a way of talking that soothed the sharp edges of loneliness. She brewed tea, tended to Sophie when she coughed, folded laundry that had sat untouched for days. She never raised her voice. She never pushed too hard. She played the part of a woman with a generous heart and steady hands. And Grant, exhausted, aching, desperate for stability, let himself believe her. Her smile had been refined, her movements graceful, her words carefully chosen. If anyone had asked Grant then whether she was a blessing, he would have said yes without hesitation. But a mask can only hold for so long. Underneath the lace dresses and soft-spoken manners hid something brittle, calculating, and quietly cruel. Grant didn't see it. Not then. Not when he wanted so badly to believe he was putting his home back together. In truth, he wasn't rebuilding anything. He was letting the snake into the house because its scales were shiny. Because grief blinds a man more effectively than whiskey. Because ranching life doesn't slow down for sorrow. Mornings came early, cattle strayed, fences broke. Deliveries had to be hauled to town before dusk. Every day pulled him in 10 different directions, leaving little room to sit, breathe, or look closely. Grant convinced himself the children needed a woman's presence, a warm figure to hold the household together while he kept the ranch afloat. He believed structure and discipline would steady them, that a stepmother could fill the spaces he couldn't. More than once, Akioha had tried to warn him in her quiet, steady way. "She's not what she pretends to be," she had said. "The little ones fear her," she had murmured. But Grant brushed it aside, thinking she was simply too protective, or perhaps misreading things through the lens of her own difficult past. To him, Akioha was a kind-hearted Apache girl with sharp instincts, but still young, still learning, still prone to seeing shadows where none existed. He trusted Patricia because it was easier. He doubted Akioha because it required courage to face the truth. Inside, he had known something was off, but men in pain sometimes cling to lies that look like salvation. Standing outside his house now, his children's knees pressed to the cold floor, Patricia looming over them with a strip of leather, everything inside Grant cracked wide open. Emma's eyes, usually so careful and composed, were wide with panic. Oliver shook like a frightened colt. Little Sophie curled inward, clutching herself as though trying to disappear. Their fear wasn't new. It wasn't sudden. It had been living in them, growing, starving, clawing, while he had been too blind to see. Grant felt shame burn through him hotter than any branding iron. He had failed them. Not because he didn't love them, but because he loved them while drowning, and drowning men don't save anyone. Akioha's whisper cut through his spiraling thoughts. "You see it now." He did, and it shattered him. He had handed his family to a woman who wrapped sweetness around cruelty, and now his children were paying the price. In that moment, raw, wordless, unforgiving, Grant Hollander learned the cost of not watching closely enough, and it nearly brought him to his knees. Akioha had come into this world beneath the shadow of the red cliffs of dry mesa, where the wind carried stories and the earth remembered every footprint. Her people had lived there long before fence lines carved up the land, before ranchers claimed pastures and soldiers built their forts. She grew up running barefoot along creek beds, learning to track deer by broken twigs and read the sky by the pattern of clouds. Her grandmother used to say she was born with the wind braided into her spirit, and sometimes Grant thought that must have been true, because the girl could sense trouble before it ever touched the ground. When she was only 10, she had witnessed something that carved itself deep into her bones. A group of border soldiers dragging 2 Apache boys from her clan, accusing them of stealing supplies. The boys were barely old enough to hold a bow. They cried, pleaded, and shook under the rough hands of men who called it discipline. Akioha watched from behind a cluster of piñon trees, helpless, tears burning her face. The cries of those boys haunted her long after the soldiers rode away. That night, staring up at the stars, she promised herself that she would never again let a child suffer if she had the strength to intervene. It was a vow she carried quietly, fiercely, like a blade hidden under soft cloth. Years later, when she sometimes visited the Hollander Ranch to help mend a wounded horse or deliver sage bundles, she began noticing things other people chose not to see. Emma's careful steps, too careful for a girl her age. The faint tremble in Oliver's voice when he answered a simple question. The way Sophie flinched when Patricia laid a hand on her shoulder, even when the gesture seemed gentle. Akioha didn't want to believe it at first. This was Grant's home. Solid, honest, built by a man who loved his children more than his own breath. But instinct, the same instinct that had protected her since childhood, whispered that something beneath that roof was wrong. Then came the bruises, small, round, oddly shaped. One on Sophie's forearm, another on her ribs. The child had tried to hide them beneath her buckskin vest, but Akioha saw. Apache women always see. And when she tucked Sophie's hair behind her ear one afternoon, her fingers brushed a welt along the girl's neck. Sophie winced, then whispered, "Please don't tell Papa." It was the way she said it, not fearful of Grant, but terrified of someone else, that shattered any doubt Akioha had left. She began listening at the edges of dusk, when the ranch fell quiet and the sky dimmed to a muted amber. Some nights she heard a muffled sob through the cracked window. Other nights, a snapped command in Patricia's cold, clipped voice. Akioha took notes the way her grandmother taught her. Short marks carved on a strip of thin bark paper she hid beneath her sash. Every bruise, every tremble, every night a child cried. She also spoke discreetly with two ranch hands who had seen Patricia lose her temper when Grant wasn't home. They didn't want trouble, but they didn't lie either. The worst part was the silence of the town. Folks in Dry Creek didn't take the word of an Apache girl over the polished manners of a white woman like Patricia. Akioha had lived long enough to know that the truth doesn't always matter when pride stands in the way. So she gathered proof, not for herself but for Grant, because he was the kind of man who needed to see it with his own eyes before he believed anyone could harm what he loved. Still, there were nights she wondered if Grant would ever listen. He was respectful, yes, and kinder to her than most men in town. But he was also tired, bone-tired, and desperate to believe his home wasn't cracking apart at the seams. When she first mentioned her concerns, he had mistaken her solemn warning for overprotective worry, shaped by the ghosts of her own past. She didn't blame him. Ghosts follow everyone in the desert. But when he looked through that narrow shutter and saw his children kneeling before Patricia's raised whip, everything shifted. For the first time, Grant didn't look past Akioha. He looked to her, straight into her dark, steady eyes, as if finally recognizing the truth she'd been carrying alone. In that brief, breathless moment, the rancher who had always stood tall seemed to fold, not in weakness, but in understanding. He believed her now. And for Akioha, who had spent her whole life fighting to protect those who could not protect themselves, that was enough to make her stand even firmer beside him, ready for whatever storm was coming. In the days that followed, Grant found himself watching his children the way a man studies a storm-damaged fence, slowly realizing the break had been there far longer than he dared admit. Now that the truth stood in plain sight, every small behavior he once brushed aside came rushing back with a sharpness that cut deeper than any spur or barbed wire. Emma, the oldest, moved through the house like someone twice her age. She rarely looked up, keeping her gaze fixed on the floorboards as if expecting them to splinter under her feet. Her shoulders, once straight and proud like her mother's, had rounded inward, folding around a quiet fear she'd learned to hide. Each time Patricia's voice had echoed through the hallway, Emma had stiffened as though bracing for thunder. Now that Grant saw it clearly, he understood. The girl hadn't been afraid of thunderstorms at all. She'd been afraid of footsteps, of that cold, clipped heel strike that meant the woman who ruled their nights was coming. Grant remembered how Emma used to run across the yard, hair flying, laughing at the wind. Now she walked carefully, measuring each step like the house itself might lash out if she moved too quickly. It crushed him to realize that his eldest had become a sentinel, not for play or exploration, but to protect her younger siblings from a danger she never should have faced. Oliver, his middle child, had shrunk even smaller inside himself. The boy apologized for things he didn't do, things no one blamed him for, things that didn't even matter. If a cup rattled on the table, Oliver whispered, "I'm sorry." If a door creaked, "I'm sorry." If anyone raised their voice, even in joy, he flinched as though expecting a blow. Grant watched him one morning press himself against a wall just to let his father pass, eyes downcast, breathing shallow. That was when the truth hit Grant hardest. His boy wasn't trying to stay out of trouble. He was trying to stay unseen. A child should never have to live like a ghost in his own home. And then there was Sophie, the baby of the family. Too small to understand cruelty, yet old enough to feel it. She was the one who had suffered in silence, the one Patricia had silenced most brutally. Sophie had always been a dreamer, the kind of little girl who whispered secrets to wildflowers and believed the moon followed her home. But after months under Patricia's shadow, those soft daydreams had turned into quivering nightmares. She cried without sound, shoulders shaking while she pressed her tiny fists against her eyes because Patricia had forbidden tears, forbidden them, as though sorrow were a crime. At night, Sophie sometimes whimpered for her mother, voice barely more than a breath. But even that had been enough to earn her punishment. Grant didn't know whether it was the grief in her tone or the innocence of her longing that enraged Patricia more. He would never know. What mattered now was that his little girl had learned to mourn in silence. All three children bore different marks of fear, but they traced back to the same source, a cruelty wrapped in polite smiles and lace gloves. Grant saw it all now, every sign he had missed while drowning in work and grief. And as he watched Emma flinch at a dropped spoon, Oliver fold into himself, and Sophie tuck her chin against her chest like a trembling fawn, something inside him cracked open wider than the desert sky. Akioha's words echoed through him, steady and sorrowful. They are not children anymore. They are shadows. He hadn't understood her then. Not really. He thought she was speaking in the poetic way Apache people sometimes did, letting nature color their language. But she hadn't been speaking in metaphor. She had been speaking the truth. His children had turned into shadows, quiet, frightened outlines of the bright souls they once were. And the worst pain of all wasn't the bruises he now noticed on Sophie, or the tremor in Oliver's hands, or the weary stillness in Emma's face. It was the knowledge that he, their father, had failed them long enough for darkness to take root. He stood in the doorway of their small shared bedroom late that night, watching them sleep, not peacefully, but restlessly, breath short, limbs tucked tight. They slept like people who feared waking. A wave of grief, raw and scorching, rolled through him. He had let this happen. He had trusted the wrong person. He had believed a lie because it was easier than facing the hardness of truth. But now, as he looked at the fragile sleep of the three souls he loved more than his own life, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would never let them be shadows again. Patricia Ellis had always known how to wear gentleness, like a well-fitted dress. In front of Grant, she moved with the practiced grace of a lady raised on polished floors, soft-spoken, apron neat, hands folded sweetly as if she had never known anger a day in her life. She brewed his coffee just the way he liked it, smoothed the children's hair in his presence, and placed Sunday roast on the table with a quiet smile that suggested competence rather than pride. To a man worn thin by loss and labor, that kind of tenderness felt like mercy itself. But the moment the front door shut behind Grant's departing boots, the air inside the Hollander home changed. The polite mask slipped like silk falling from a shoulder, revealing something sharp and cold beneath. Her voice, once syrup-sweet, turned hard, metallic. The children stiffened instinctively, as though bracing for a storm. Patricia's hands, delicate in front of their father, became the hands of someone who enjoyed control more than compassion. She kept a leather whip tucked behind the pantry door, not because she needed it, but because the children feared it. She would flick it against her skirt, letting the crack echo cruelly through the small house. Sophie often clamped her hands over her ears. Oliver's breathing turned shallow. Emma stepped protectively in front of her siblings, a little girl standing where an adult should have been. Patricia didn't always strike. Sometimes she preferred words which cut deeper than lashes. "If you keep acting like this, your father will send you all away," she would say, voice smooth but poisoned. "He doesn't want children who can't behave. He told me so. They'll put you in a reform school, I'll make sure of it. And worst of all, speak one word about me, and your father will believe me, not you." That was how she held them. By fear, by lies, by twisting their trust in the one person who loved them unconditionally. She didn't hit them every day. She didn't have to. She planted doubt like seeds in cracked soil, watering it with threats until the children questioned their own memories, their own worth, even their father's love. Emma stopped asking Grant for help. Oliver stopped speaking up altogether. Sophie learned to cry without sound, burying her face in her blanket because noise brought punishment. And Grant, coming home late, tired, wanting desperately to believe the world inside his walls was safe, never saw the small moments where everything fell apart. But Akioha did. The Apache girl watched the house the way a hawk watches a canyon floor, noting each unnatural silence, each hurried whisper, each bruise half hidden beneath sleeves. She glimpsed the children scrubbing floors on their knees long after dusk, caught sight of Patricia gripping Sophie's arm too tightly, heard Oliver muttering apologies to no one. These weren't the small misbehaviors of childhood. They were the bruised echoes of fear. Akioha's instincts were too sharp, too seasoned by her childhood memories to ignore what others might dismiss. So she acted the only way she knew how, quietly, carefully, like moving through tall grass where rattlesnakes slept. She carved slivers of charcoal-thin stone, Apache-style sound catchers used by her elders, and slid them between the gaps in the wooden walls, close enough to catch the edge of Patricia's voice. The recordings were crude, little more than vibrations pressed into thin shards, but they carried tone, anger, cruelty, threats. Enough to prove that the woman behind those lace gloves was not what she claimed to be. Then she spoke privately to two ranch hands who had witnessed more than they meant to. One admitted he saw Patricia yank Sophie by the hair when she thought no one was watching. Another confessed he heard her threaten Oliver with a switch if he dared leave the table before finishing chores meant for grown men. They were afraid to involve themselves, but Akioha's unwavering gaze, steady as a desert rock, fierce as the noon sun, pulled reluctant truth from their throats. She collected every scrap, every whispered admission, every carved shard, hiding them in a deerskin pouch beneath her vest. Not because she wanted to prove herself right, but because Grant deserved the truth and the children deserved rescue. By the time Grant finally saw his children kneeling beneath Patricia's raised whip, the shift in his eyes told Akioha everything. He no longer saw her as an overly cautious Apache girl with too many memories of past cruelty. He saw her as the only person brave enough to stand between his children and the woman he had mistakenly welcomed into their lives. For the first time, he believed her completely. The sky that evening looked like it had been split open by a red-hot blade. A deep, blood-colored light bled across the horizon, casting long, uneasy shadows over the dry mesa plains. Grant rode hard, the wind slapping his coat, dust clawing at his eyes. The ranch buildings rose through the shimmering haze, trembling in the gusts like they sensed the same danger he did. A violent gust slammed the barn door so loudly it echoed across the yard. Another tore shingles from the chicken shed. The wind had the anger of a coming storm, wild, unpredictable, impatient. Grant felt every bit of it in his bones. Something was wrong, more wrong than before. He dismounted before the horse even stopped, boots hitting the ground in a heavy, determined thud. As he strode toward the porch, a figure darted from the shadows and seized his arm. Akioha. Her breath came quick, her dark braid whipping across her shoulder. Her eyes, sharp, storm-lit, unflinching, cut through the rising wind. "Don't go in yet," she said, voice low and tight. "Tonight? Tonight she means to punish them worse than before." The words punched the air from Grant's lungs. "How do you know?" he rasped. "She told them. I heard it. She said she'd make them silent for good." Grant's jaw clenched, and something lethal flickered in his eyes. Without hesitating, he shoved the door open so hard it ricocheted against the wall. What he walked into froze his blood. Patricia stood in the center of the lamplight, whip raised high, its shadow trembling on the ceiling like a serpent ready to strike. The children were huddled together on the floor, Emma shielding Oliver and Sophie with her own trembling body. Their faces were wet with silent tears, shoulders hunched, small hands clasped in helpless fear. "Enough!" Grant roared, his voice cracking like thunder across the cramped room. Patricia froze mid-swing, then spun around with a gasp, sharp enough to slice air. In the blink of an eye, she transformed, her face softening, lips quivering, hands fluttering to her chest as though she were the one terrified. "Oh, Grant," she sobbed. "Thank goodness you came. These ungrateful children, they attacked me. I tried to calm them. They're out of control. I don't know what's gotten into them lately." Grant stared at her, disbelief warring with fury. Emma shook her head frantically. Oliver choked back a sob. Sophie whimpered, shrinking behind her siblings. Before Patricia could step toward him, Akioha entered the room. Silent but radiating a fire no storm could extinguish. In one swift motion, she pulled a worn buckskin pouch from her belt and spilled its contents onto the table. Thin strips of bark, charcoal-etched notes, marks and dates, testimonies from ranch hands, drawings of bruises, hours of recorded cruelty pressed into stone. The truth, ugly, undeniable, hit the table like a hammer. Grant's gaze snapped to Patricia. "What is all this?" he demanded, voice dangerously calm. Patricia's expression flickered. Fear, then rage, then the practiced innocence she'd perfected since the day she stepped into this house. "It's lies," she spat. "Apache tricks. She hates me because you married me. She's poisoning your mind. These children are liars. They—" "Stop." Grant's voice cut through her excuses. He turned to his children, kneeling down so he was eye level. His hands shook, not with anger, but with heartbreak. "Tell me the truth," he whispered. Emma's face crumpled first, then Oliver's. But it was Sophie, sweet, trembling Sophie, who broke the last wall. She said you didn't love us anymore," the little girl sobbed. "She said if we talked, you'd send us away." Grant pulled all three of them into his arms, feeling their tears soak into his shirt. His own throat burned with the kind of pain that hollows a man from the inside out. He stood slowly, turning back to Patricia with a look that could have stopped a wild stallion mid-charge. "Get out!" She blinked as if she hadn't heard him. "Grant, darling." "Out," he growled, voice low, final, unshakable. "You lay a hand on my children, you threaten them, you lie to them, and you still think you're staying under my roof?" Patricia's mask shattered then, revealing nothing but venom underneath. She hissed something ugly under her breath and grabbed her coat. Storm wind blasted the door open as she stepped onto the porch. Her silhouette twisted in the chaotic light, a wounded animal snarling against defeat. She mounted her horse with jerky movements and kicked it into the night, disappearing into the red-streaked darkness like a creature driven from its den. Grant stood in the doorway long after she was gone, the wind howling around him. Behind him, his children clung to Akioha, finally letting themselves cry where they felt safe. The storm had broken, but for the first time in a long time, so had the silence. That night, for the first time in far too many months, the Hollander house held no echo of a whip cracking through the dark. No sharp commands, no muffled sobs, just the quiet hum of a lantern and the soft, trembling breaths of three children trying to relearn what safety felt like. Grant spread blankets across the living room floor, close to the warm glow of the hearth. Emma curled against his left side, her small frame rigid at first, only relaxing when she realized he wasn't going anywhere. Oliver pressed close to his right, clutching his father's sleeve like it was the only solid thing left in the world. And little Sophie, usually eager to claim her own space, burrowed herself onto his chest, arms wrapped tight around him as though a moment of separation might make the nightmare return. Grant didn't try to sleep. He couldn't. He listened to their breaths, uneven, fragile, exhausted, and felt each one carved deeper into his heart. They lay so close to him, like they feared he might vanish if they blinked. Like he was the last barrier between them and the darkness they'd lived under. He stroked Sophie's back, slow and gentle, remembering how she used to fall asleep riding in the wagon beside her mother. Emma occasionally jerked awake, eyes darting toward the hallway where Patricia once stood. Oliver whimpered once, then settled again only when Grant tightened his hold. It was then he realized just how much damage a single person's cruelty could do, and how long it would take to undo it. Outside, the wind softened. The storm that had prowled around the ranch earlier now drifted off into the distant hills, leaving the land washed in a cold, clean stillness. Inside, the warmth of the fire painted soft gold across the walls, as if the house itself were sighing in relief. When the children finally surrendered to sleep, exhaustion dragging them under, Grant eased himself up, careful not to wake them. He stepped to the hallway and paused at the kitchen doorway. Akioha knelt beside the wash basin, grinding herbs between her palms. The scent of sage, wild mint, and yarrow, sense of the desert, of healing, rose into the air. Her movements were calm, deliberate, the way someone works when they have done the same act 100 times for those they love. She dipped a cloth into the mixture and moved back toward the children. The fire cast her shadow long across the floor, like a guardian spirit watching over the wounded. One by one, she tended to them. She brushed cooling balm along Sophie's bruised ribs, humming an old Apache lullaby, a low melodic tune that rose and fell like wind sliding through canyon walls. She whispered soft encouragement to Emma, smoothing salve along the girl's arms. For Oliver, she pressed her hand gently to his trembling shoulder before applying the herbal paste. No one had asked her to do this. She didn't expect thanks. She simply moved with a quiet devotion that made Grant's chest tighten. He stood in the doorway, one hand braced on the frame, watching. There was something different in his eyes now, something gentler, humbled, stirred by the sight of this young Apache woman piecing his family back together in ways he didn't even know how to begin. For months, he had been blind, weighed down by his own grief. Akioha had seen what he couldn't. She had fought for his children when he didn't even know they needed saving. She stepped in with the kind of courage that didn't seek praise, just justice. A wave of gratitude washed through him so fierce and so unexpected that he had to steady himself. When she finally noticed him, Akioha didn't startle. She looked up, her dark eyes catching the firelight, reflecting something steady and kind. "I use these herbs on my little cousins," she said softly. "It will ease the soreness." Grant's voice felt rough in his throat. "You didn't have to stay this long." Her gaze flicked to the children, sleeping against the hearth. "Yes," she replied simply. "I did." He swallowed hard. Words gathered in his chest, too many, all tangled. A simple thank you felt small compared to the weight of what she had done. But he didn't know how to say more. What he did know was this. He owed Akioha something far greater than gratitude. He owed her trust. He owed her his family's healing. And deep down, though he wouldn't admit it aloud, he owed her the restoration of a part of himself he thought had died with his wife. As the fire crackled softly and the children slept, Grant realized that tonight, the pieces of his shattered home weren't just being gathered. They were beginning to fit back together. And the first steady hands to lift those pieces were hers. Dawn crept over the horizon like a quiet promise, washing the Mercer Ranch in soft gold. For the first time in what felt like ages, the land didn't feel haunted. The storm had passed, outside and within, and the morning air held the crisp scent of sage and sun-warmed dust. Grant stood on the porch, coffee in hand, watching his children step into the new day with a steadiness he hadn't seen since before Patricia's shadow stretched over their lives. Emma was the first to emerge from the barn, her boots kicking up small puffs of dust as she led Buckshot by the reins. The horse snorted, impatient but gentle, sensing the girl's nervous excitement. She had always been delicate, a quiet thing who flinched at raised voices and sudden movements. But now, after a night free of fear, she lifted her chin with a determination that caught Grant off guard. Akioha walked beside her, calm and instructive, showing her how to place her foot in the stirrup and settle into the saddle with balance. Emma's hands trembled at first. Her breath came sharp and short. But when Akioha rested a steady palm on her knee, the girl took a deeper breath, one rooted in newfound courage. Grant watched as Emma tightened her grip on the reins, not timidly, but firmly, like someone reaching toward a version of herself she didn't yet know she could become. "Easy," Akioha murmured, her voice low, musical, carrying the grounded warmth of the desert. "You guide him, not with force, but with trust." Emma nodded. When Buckshot began to move, Emma held steady, not perfect, not fearless, but strong. Stronger than yesterday. Stronger than the little girl who used to shrink behind her stepmother's skirt. Grant felt something loosen inside him. Pride swelling, guilt softening, hope beginning. On the other side of the yard, Oliver knelt beside the broken fence line with Grant. The boy's face carried fresh color, not the pale, hollow look fear had carved into him. He handed Grant nails, fetched the hammer, steadied posts with quicker, more confident hands than before. And then, out of nowhere, it happened. A small laugh, bright and startled, slipping from Oliver's lips when the family dog barreled past chasing a tumbleweed. Grant froze at the sound. Months had gone by since he'd heard even a tired chuckle from his son. But this was a real laugh, a boy's laugh, a sound that belonged to sunshine, not dread. "Good to hear that again," Grant said, voice thick with emotion he tried to swallow down. Oliver blushed but didn't look away. "Feels good, Pa." Nearby, Sophie followed Akioha through the tall grass beyond the corral, her tiny hands gripping a woven basket. The little girl's steps were quicker today, skipping occasionally as if joy were beginning to seep back into her bones. Akioha knelt to show her which herbs were good for soothing bruises, which roots were helpful for tea, which petals held healing oils. Sophie listened with wide, earnest eyes, leaning closer every time Akioha pointed. At one moment, Sophie slipped her small hand into Akioha's without thinking, instinctive, trusting, seeking something soft and mother-like, and Akioha, without hesitation, gently squeezed her hand back. Grant watched from across the yard, and something in the scene hit him like a slow, deep ache. Not painful, just real. Sophie hadn't reached for anyone like that since his wife died, and Akioha had accepted it with the quiet understanding of someone who knew loss as intimately as breath. Later, when the chores settled and the sun climbed higher, Grant approached Akioha near the herb patch. She looked up at him, her braids sweeping over her shoulder, her hands stained a soft green from crushed leaves. Dust shimmered in the warm air between them. "You've given my children more than I ever knew they needed," Grant said, voice low, rough with sincerity. "Seems like every day you're patching something I missed." Akioha didn't smile immediately. She studied him, really studied him, as though peeling back the layers of a man who carried both strength and regret in equal measure. "They were hurting," she answered quietly, "and hurt knows how to call to someone who's lived through storms." Grant exhaled, slow, heavy. For the first time since he'd met her, he saw not just the fierce protector she'd been, but the woman beneath. A woman shaped by hardship, carrying her own invisible wounds, yet still offering warmth like it cost her nothing. It wasn't love rising between them. Not yet. It was something gentler, deeper, an understanding formed in the wreckage life had handed them, a shared resilience, a quiet bond built not on romance but on survival and the simple miracle of healing. The sun dipped behind them, painting the fields in molten gold, and Grant realized the ranch didn't just feel safe again. It felt alive. And a part of that life was Akioha. Night settled softly over the Mercer Ranch, the kind of quiet, amber-blue dusk that makes even the hard earth breathe slower. A thin ribbon of smoke curled from the chimney, carrying the scent of cedar wood and something tender stirring inside the walls of the house. Grant stood out by the corral fence, fingers hooked over the worn timber, staring out at the rolling fields where the last light sank into the grass. He looked like a man made of grit and bone. But tonight, beneath that weathered exterior, something was trembling loose. Akioha approached silently, the way only someone raised by wind and desert stone could. Her footsteps didn't crunch the dirt. They drifted. The soft rustle of her buckskin fringe was the only sign she was near. She stopped beside him, watching the horizon the way he did, as though trying to read something carried inside the fading orange. "You're carrying a storm," she murmured. Grant exhaled, long and unsteady. "I am," he admitted, his voice low, the words dragged out like a confession scraped from his chest. "I keep trying to pretend I'm strong enough to shoulder everything alone. But every time I look at my kids, I feel like I failed them before I ever had a chance to protect them." He swallowed hard, jaw tightening. "A man's supposed to guard his home, keep darkness off his porch. And I let it inside. I let that woman hurt them right under my roof." The guilt hung in the air like smoke, thick, stubborn, choking. Akioha didn't rush to speak. That wasn't her way. She let his words settle, let the silence warm them instead of freeze them. When she finally turned toward him, her dark eyes reflected firelight from the house behind them. Deep, steady, unwavering. "In my childhood," she began softly, "soldiers rode through our camp. They did not see us as people. They saw us as something small, something quiet enough to break. Her voice tightened, not with fear but with the sharp clarity of memory. I saw little ones beaten for picking up dropped food. I saw mothers forced to silence their babies because crying made soldiers restless. She pressed a hand to her own chest, as though steadying the heartbeat beneath. I was one of those children who learned too early that adults can fail you, that safety can be a lie. She paused and her breath trembled just once. That day, I swore to the spirits in the sky that I would never let a child suffer if I could stand between them and harm. Grant turned toward her fully now. The pain in her voice echoed his own, not identical but carved from the same kind of sorrow. Two people shaped by wounds they didn't ask for. That's why you stepped in with my kids, he whispered. Not a question, an understanding. That is why I step in with any child, she corrected softly. But your children, her voice grew gentler. Your children needed someone to remind them what safety feels like. You were not blind, Grant. You were grieving. And grief makes shadows bigger than they are. He looked away ashamed. Still doesn't excuse me. Akioha stepped closer, so close he could smell the faint sweetness of crushed sage on her skin. Her hand rose, hesitated just a breath, then rested over his chest, right above the place his heart thudded, heavy and hurting. Her touch was warm, grounding, steady as the earth she came from. You are not losing them, she said, her voice low but firm, like a vow spoken into wind. Children do not stop loving a father who fights for them. They only need to see you stand on their side. Grant's breath caught. No woman had touched him like that in years, not with desire but with truth. No one had seen past his battered pride to the wounded man beneath. He covered her hand with his own, rough fingers curling gently around hers. The contact was simple, but something powerful moved through it, a spark of recognition between two souls shaped by hardship. Two people who understood quiet suffering instinctively. There was no flirtation in it, no sweetness, just raw honesty, a connection forged not in firelight romance but in the steady rebuilding of broken things. Akioha held his gaze unwavering. Your heart is strong, she whispered. But strength is not silence. Strength is choosing to stand again, even when the world tells you you've already fallen. Grant swallowed, eyes stinging. How do you always know what to say? I don't, she answered with a faint, gentle smile. I only speak the truth I needed to hear once. The wind swept across the pasture, carrying the scent of sagebrush and the whisper of something tender awakening between them. Something fragile, something tentative, something earned. Not love. Not yet. But the beginning of a bond deeper than words. A cowboy's worn-down heart finding steady grounding in the spirit of an Apache woman who had been forged by storms harsher than his own. And for the first time in a long while, Grant felt unbroken. Sunrise washed over the Hollander Ranch the way a gentle hand smooths the creases from a worn blanket. The land, once tight with tension, now breathed easy. The barn doors swung open without dread. The red dirt yard carried only hoof prints and children's laughter. No shadows curling in the corners. No fear sinking its claws into the walls. Inside the kitchen, pots clattered, bread baked golden. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the house echoed with the pure, ringing sound of children laughing until they hiccuped. Emma teased Oliver for dropping flour everywhere. Sophie tried to braid Emma's hair and ended up tying a ribbon around the cat instead. Their voices, bright, innocent, untangled, floated through the morning air like birds finally returning after a long, merciless winter. Grant stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame, arms crossed, a slow smile cracking the hardness that had lived on his face far too long. Every soft sound, every burst of laughter, found the empty spaces inside him and filled them. In the corral, the horses seemed to sense the change too. They ran with unburdened strides, tossing their manes as though grateful that the shouts and sharp commands of the past were gone. Grant could swear the whole ranch, earth, timber, beasts, had loosened its shoulders. But the greatest shift was the one he felt in himself. That afternoon, the sun dropped low and wide across the land, spreading a honey-colored warmth that softened even the fence posts. Akioha stood near the cottonwood tree, her braids catching glints of gold as she ground sage into a small clay bowl. Sophie hovered close, curious as always. Emma helped gather fallen branches. Oliver tried to carve a tiny wooden horse, tongue stuck out in concentration. They looked, without anyone meaning to, as though they were already a family. Grant walked toward them, boots scuffing gently over the dirt. For a long moment, he simply watched. Akioha smiling as Sophie handed her a leaf shaped like a heart. Emma chattering about her first successful gallop that morning. Oliver grinning shyly when his wooden horse snapped in half, and Akioha reassured him she could mend anything made of wood or bone. It hit Grant like a warm wind to the chest. Unexpected but steady. This was the life he had once feared he'd never see again. He cleared his throat, and everyone looked up. Akioha straightened, brushing dust from her hands. "Grant?" she asked softly, her voice warm and calm like dust settling over a meadow. He nodded, suddenly feeling younger and older at the same time. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you." His gaze flicked to the children. 3 small faces full of trust now, instead of dread. "You've done more for this family than I can ever repay. More than I knew I needed." Akioha's expression didn't change dramatically. That wasn't her way. But her eyes softened, deepening with quiet curiosity. Grant took a slow breath. "I'm not asking you to replace anyone. Not their mama, not the life you had before. But this ranch?" He paused, searching for words that felt too big for his chest. "It's brighter with you here. The kids, hell, even the horses, stand taller when you're around." The wind rustled cottonwood leaves overhead, scattering golden flecks of light across the ground like blessings. "I was wondering," he continued carefully, reverently, "if you'd consider staying close. Not out of duty, not out of obligation. Just stay because this place feels right. Because maybe we're all less lost when you're near." For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then Sophie darted forward, hugging Akioha's leg as though sealing the decision for her. Emma smiled, the strong, steady kind of smile that came from healing. Oliver looked hopeful, eyes shining in a way Grant hadn't seen since his wife passed. Akioha looked around. The children, the cottonwood, the rolling fields painted in the sunset gold. She placed a hand over her chest, just above the place where her spirit felt the wind most clearly. "This land listens," she murmured, "and today it whispers the same thing your heart does." She lifted her chin slightly. "Yes, Grant, I'll stay." Something unclenched inside him, a tight, unseen knot that had lived there far too long. Later, as the sun dipped into the horizon, Grant stood beneath the cottonwood watching Akioha and the children chase each other in the tall grass, their laughter carrying across the ranch like music woven from the wind itself. Sophie's braid flew behind her. Emma lifted Oliver onto her back. Akioha spun them around, laughing with her whole face, unguarded, unafraid. Grant whispered into the warm twilight, voice thick with gratitude and something deeper blooming, slow and sure. "Finally, this is home. A home rebuilt not from bricks or timber, but from courage, from the healing hands of a girl of the Apache wind, from the hope of children learning to trust again, and from the quiet, steadfast heart of a cowboy who almost lost everything, until fate brought back the light he thought he'd buried."